Today we're jumping in and taking a proper look at SurrounDead, a survival game currently available on PC via Steam. It's a title that caught my attention because it sits firmly in that open world craft survival space, blending scavenging, exploration, and moment-to-moment tension that immediately felt familiar, but distinct enough to be worth digging into. Before getting into the details, it's important to set expectations. SurrounDead is currently in early access, and that shows in a few places. This isn't a fully polished experience yet. You may run into bugs, rough edges, and systems that are still in their infancy. That said, based on the time I've spent with it, the overall experience has been solid. For a bit of context where I'm coming from, I'm a huge fan of craft survival games. If you've been around the channel for a while, you know I've spent a lot of time with games in this genre, especially titles like DayZ. I put a good chunk of hours into SurrounDead already, and I've genuinely been enjoying it so far. What makes that even more impressive is the fact that the game has been developed by one solo developer, known as Survivor. I've been exploring the game live on stream every Tuesday and Thursday, if you want to pop by and say hi. At its core, SurrounDead is an open world survival game set in a world ravaged by an apocalyptic catastrophe. Society has collapsed, the dead roam freely, and everything in the environment feels hostile. Survival isn't the goal you reach, it's something you constantly fight to maintain, with the infected acting as a relentless pressure rather than just background threats. From a genre perspective, this is a zombie craft survival game played entirely from the perspective of your own customizable survivor. Right from the start, the game encourages you to shape your character, which immediately makes each playthrough feel personal. I started playing SurrounDead in January 26, so if you've been here since its release in 2022, I'd genuinely be interested to hear how you think the game has evolved over these 4 years. Character creation offers a good number of options, and for me, being able to create my own survivor helps form an early connection to the world and the journey ahead. You can even choose a prior occupation for your character. At the moment, from what I've read, this doesn't seem to have any meaningful impact on gameplay, but it feels like a system that could be expanded in future updates, potentially influencing playstyles or stats. In terms of what the game wants you to feel, SurrounDead is clear in its intent. It wants you to feel vulnerable. You will die a lot, especially early on, and it's very easy to become overwhelmed if you're not paying attention to your surroundings or managing your resources properly. The game doesn't hold your hand and mistakes are quickly punished. Don't let the blocky geometry, bright colours, or minimal textures fool you either. Beneath that visual simplicity is a surprising amount of depth, and it's the kind of game that keeps pulling you back in, even after a rough death. Where SurrounDead really stands out for me is the visual identity. This is the first craft survival game I've personally played that uses this blocky geometry art style, and it generally has me hooked. I grew up in an era of far more limited visuals, playing 2D games on now retro consoles, especially sinking countless hours into games like Tetris on the original Game Boy. I still remember having to angle the screen just right to catch the light, because there was no backlight built in, and because of that, graphics have never been high on my priority list when it comes to judging a game. Visuals alone won't make or break the experience for me. What really matters are things like clunky mechanics, poor audio design, or systems that break immersion. Sure, visuals can pull you into the world, but it's everything else that keeps you there. That said, SurrounDead's blocky presentation, similar in style to Minecraft, actually looks fantastic. The map has a real charm to it, with each area feeling distinct and deliberately crafted. Exploration feels rewarding, and I constantly find myself wanting to push a little further just to see what's over the next hill. It's a beautifully designed world, and one that feels carefully built rather than randomly assembled. A typical session in SurrounDead starts with you trying to stay alive long enough for anything else to matter. I'll be honest, I accidentally skipped the tutorial when I first jumped in, which meant my early hours were rough. A lot of learning happened on the fly, and while there was certain fun in figuring things out the hard way, probably wouldn't recommend skipping it intentionally. Once the basics clicked though, I settled into the game pretty quickly. Like any craft survival game, your immediate focus is survival. That means managing your food and thirst and keeping an eye on your health. And most importantly, staying alive while infected zombies roam across the map. Once you start getting the handle on those systems, the game naturally pushes you towards looting. And this is where SurrounDead does something genuinely interesting. Looting in survival games can easily become monotonous, but here it feels more deliberate. Each search uses a short timer, which adds tension, especially if you're looting in a dangerous area. That moment of being locked into an animation while the world continues around you can get you killed if you're careless. On top of that, failing a quick search creates noise, which can attract zombies nearby. It turns looting into a risk assessment rather than a mindless interaction, and that little bit of friction adds a real spice to the exploration. Loot itself is handled well. Containers are clearly classified, so you'll know whether you're searching a medical, military, or industrial supplies. That alone adds intent to scavenging, because you're not just opening random boxes and hoping for the best. you can actually make informed decisions about where to go based on what you need. Straight away, that's something that clicked for me. One of the ways I personally judge a game is how excited I am to jump back in for the next session, and SurrounDead passed that test almost immediately. I constantly find myself looking forward to the next session and curious to see more of what the world has to offer. Progression in SurrounDead is split between levels and skills. There's a leveling system with a current cap of 40, and pretty much everything you do feeds experience into that. Each level earns you ability points, which can be spent on a skill tree to unlock specific perks. At the moment, the skill tree feels pretty limited, to the point where I sometimes forget to spend the points altogether. The more meaningful progression comes from your core skills, things like fitness, reloading, or fishing, which level up naturally as you perform those actions in the world. When you die, you drop experience and lose player levels, but from what I can tell, the core skill levels remain intact. That softens the blow slightly, but death still hurts. Risk versus reward is baked deeply into how the world is structured. If you want better loot, you have to push into more heavily infested areas. Major landmarks often contain primary infestations guarded by mini-bosses, and clearing these out gives you access to higher tier weapons and armor. In some games, this kind of structure can feel like a checklist, but SurrounDead avoids that trap surprisingly well. No 2 points of interest feel the same, and exploration retains that sense of unpredictability. Death, however, is where the game can be particularly unforgiving. When you die, you lose everything you were carrying. You can retrieve it, but there is no clear map indicator showing you where you fell, so finding your body isn't always straightforward. I also learned the hard way that if you log out before recovering your gear, it's gone for good. Anything not stored in a place container or vehicle disappears when the world resets. And yes, that includes some very painful losses. Logging out resets the world state, zombies respawn, loot refreshes, and anything left on the ground is wiped. Base items and stored gear have been safe so far, but losing high tier loot between sessions is frustrating, even if part of that comes down to learning the system. As for how often the loop changes, it mainly evolves through consequences rather than new mechanics. The more gear you acquire, the scarier it becomes to lose it, and that tension subtly changes how you play. Clearing areas becomes more of a routine over time, but the threat of being overwhelmed never fully disappears. In terms of structure, there's currently only one main quest, which is to locate the first safe zone. Once that's done, the world essentially opens up. Right now, that does feel a bit underwhelming, especially since there's next to no lore to contextualize the world. Additional objectives come in the form of intel quests via military cases, which you can buy from traders or obtain from hostile human enemies. These quests do offer strong rewards, but they don't form a larger narrative thread yet. There are also limited time events, mainly airdrops. If you hear the audio cue and spot the smoke, it's worth investigating, as these can contain valuable loot. Just be aware they might be guarded, and diving in unprepared can end badly. This loop isn't flashy, and it doesn't constantly reinvent itself, but it's deliberate and tense. Once it gets a hold of you, it's hard not to keep pushing a little further. On a moment-to-moment level, SurrounDead feels good to play, and that matters more than visuals. For me, fluidity and responsiveness are non-negotiable. If a game feels clunky or unresponsive, I turn on it very quickly, no matter how good the ideas are. Thankfully, SurrounDead avoids that problem. Movement, interaction, and general controls feel tight and responsive, which means the core loop is enjoyable rather than frustrating. Inventory management is another area where execution really shines. The system of bags within bags, with dedicated containers for specific item types, works extremely well. You've got medical cases, tool bags for crafting materials, and even a wallet for purely cash and cards. It keeps things organized and makes looting feel purposeful instead of overwhelming. Now, the amount of weight you can realistically carry is questionable. Stuffing 5 metal chain link fences into a dry sack placed inside of a backpack shoved into a duffel bag, and casually carrying around 2 full jerry cans of fuel on top of that probably wouldn't end well in real life. There's no stamina penalty for overloading yourself either, but honestly, I'm not complaining. It all means those years of playing Tetris finally amount to something useful. Driving is another mechanic that feels like a major part of the experience, and thankfully, is genuinely fun. Vehicles handle well overall, and each one feels distinct. So far I've driven the ambulance, a sedan, and one of the trucks, and they all behave slightly differently. That said, some objectives in the world behave like invisible brick walls, and hitting them at speed can send your car flying in a way that feels dramatic. I've also come across a camper van and marked it on the map to go back to later, but after my first towing experience, I decided I wasn't brave enough to try and drag that one home yet. Enemy behaviour is where the game's tension really comes in. Zombies are easy to underestimate, and that's usually a mistake. They swarm quickly, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed if you're not careful. They're not particularly intelligent, and you can avoid or outplay them in a lot of situations, but you're still limited by your stamina. Burn through that too fast, and things can spiral quickly. If you weren't able to cheese some of the encounters by using terrain or positioning, the death count would probably be significantly higher. Bosses at points of interest are a different story. They don't care if you've climbed to a high spot, they'll find a way to reach you. There are also sprinter zombies that can latch onto you, explosive variants that punish sloppy positioning, and overall, enough variety to keep you on edge. One detail I really like is how zombies react to sound. Trigger a noise in one area, and they'll investigate that location and linger there, which adds a real layer of tactical decision making that feels intentional rather than accidental. This is also a section where early access starts to show its seams, particularly with the crafting and base building. My first impressions with the crafting felt clunky and in need of refinement. There's a snapping system that you can toggle on with Shift F, but I struggled to get floors, foundations, or staircases to snap properly. That could easily have been user error, but it wasn't immediately intuitive. What I would like to see is a blueprint system. Being able to place a blueprint down and gradually add the required materials helps visualize what you're building, something games like Grounded do very well. After spending a bit more time with the system though, it started to make a bit more sense, and I was able to put together a small holding on the map. There's definitely potential here for some impressive bases. One odd limitation I notice is certain items like wells or fire pits can't be placed unless they're on flooring or foundations if snapping is enabled. That feels restrictive in a way that doesn't really make sense. That said, if base building wasn't in the game at all, I don't think I'd miss it in its current state. I'm having far more fun exploring, looting and surviving, and most of what I want to keep ends up stored in the back of a vehicle rather than in a permanent base anyway. Visually, SurrounDead leans into that blocky geometry art style, and that's something I touched on earlier in the review. What surprised me is how quickly that visual style fades into the background once you actually start playing. You acclimatise to it fast, and it never felt like the blocky look broke the immersion whilst exploring or surviving. The only visual element that slightly stood out was the day-night cycle. Transitions happen in a noticeable step rather than smoothly, almost frame by frame. It's something you'll catch if you're looking for it, but it's not game-breaking, and I don't think most players would notice it unless it was pointed out. The map itself has a lot of charm. Each area feels distinct, with different hazards and environmental features that help separate regions from one another. Exploration feels intentional rather than repetitive, and I constantly find myself wanting to push further into new areas. I don't want to give too much away here, but the world has been clearly designed with care. On top of that, there are varied weather patterns that change the feel of the environment, which helps the world feel alive rather than static. Audio is where SurrounDead really shines for me. Anyone who's watched my reviews before will know that sound design is an often make or break factor for me in the game. And thankfully, SurrounDead gets it right. The overall soundscape, especially during weather events, is very well crafted and adds significantly to the immersion. The soundtrack complements the experience rather than overpowering it. And there's an acoustic track that plays whilst exploring that you might not even notice at first until you realise you're humming along to it. That kind of subtlety goes a long way. That said, the audio isn't completely without its flaws. Zombie footstep sounds can be inconsistent, and there were moments early on where enemies managed to sneak up on me without much warning. That could be intentional, but it was frustrating at first, especially when it resulted in a sudden death. On the flip side, it does force you to stay alert, double back, and make sure areas are actually clear before relaxing. There are also some volume balancing issues. Certain audio elements, particularly storms, are noticeably louder than the rest of the mix. Even after adjusting the levels on the audio mixer, storms were made significantly louder, and that contrast was especially obvious when moving into a landmark. Overall, the combination of a distinctive visual style and strong audio design does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to immersion. SurrounDead might not rely on graphical fidelity to pull you in, but through atmosphere, sound, and world design, it manages to create a space that feels worth surviving in. In its current state, SurrounDead has enough content to keep you entertained for a good number of hours, especially if you enjoy sandbox survival experiences that create their own stories. Exploration, looting, base experimentation, and learning how to survive more efficiently all carries real weight. And if you're the type of player who enjoys high stakes, there's even a permadeath mode that completely changes how you approach risk. While the game doesn't yet have a deep narrative structure, the systems in place are strong enough to support extended playtime without feeling like you've seen everything too quickly. Looking ahead, the future of the game is where things get particularly interesting. According to the roadmap shared by the solo developer, Survivor, there are some substantial updates planned. These include endgame content, expanded lore, additional quest systems, and more involved vehicle mechanics that require things like keys and engine parts to function. Those kind of systems would add meaningful layers to progression and decision making, especially for long-term players. There's a clear sense of foundation that is being built now to support something much deeper over time. Also, something that has been mentioned is the introduction of multiplayer. which I'll be keeping a close eye on, especially to see how it changes the balance of the game. As for whether it's worth jumping into now or waiting, I'd recommend playing it now if you're looking for something fresh and genuinely enjoyable. The game already delivers a solid survival experience, and despite its early access status, it feels playable and surprisingly cohesive. If you're comfortable with a few rough edges and the idea that systems will continue to evolve, there's plenty here to justify diving in rather than sitting on the sidelines. Overall, despite its frustrations, many of which come down to my own mistakes, I walk away from every session of SurrounDead genuinely looking forward to playing more. It's a very satisfying game to spend time with, even when it punishes you for getting things wrong. The strongest element by far is the exploration. The world is beautifully crafted, with enough variety and environmental detail to keep pushing you forward. There's always something new to uncover, and the map does an excellent job of rewarding curiosity. Even with a few minor audio and visual issues, the sense of discovery never really drops. That's a big part of what makes the experience so compelling. The biggest drawback for me is the base building. It does the job, but it never fully clicked. It feels like a system that exists more because it's expected of a genre, rather than because the game truly needs it right now. I already felt the urge to build an elaborate stronghold, especially when more essential items end up stored in the vehicle instead. I do think this will improve over time, particularly once more lore and structured content are added, which should help give these systems more purpose. Taking everything into account, SurrounDead earns a solid 3 out of 5 for me. It's a solid foundation with clear potential, and I'm especially interested to see where it goes as development continues and multiplayer is introduced way into the future. With more quests and deeper lore, the overall experience could be far more satisfying to progress through. I'll definitely keep playing and watching how the game develops. What Survivor has achieved so far as a solo developer is genuinely impressive. If you're interested, I'll also be streaming SurrounDead for a few more weeks, so feel free to drop by and say hi when I'm live. Let me know your thoughts on SurrounDead, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.